So I already said a few words about our initiative, the transdisciplinary research area. I don't want to go into more detail. I rather take the time to introduce our speaker. We are grateful that Matin Qaim has agreed to give a lecture. He has been sneaking in prior lectures, so he knows the format. Matin is a professor of international food economics at the University of Göttingen. And when I looked into your CV this morning, Matin, I realized that you're actually a Rhinelander. I don't know whether you call yourself like that, but you went to school in Jülich. You actually studied the first part of your degree, the Vordiplom, here at University of Bonn, then went to Kiel, came back to Bonn for the PhD and the habilitation, spent some time in California, in Berkeley, University of California, and then came to Hohenheim, and then where you are now in Göttingen. Matin's main research areas are in the economics of biotechnology and agricultural research systems, food security and sustainable food systems, which is also the focus of the lecture today. You can see the title here, and rural development policy. And Matin has research experience all over the world, in Europe, the US, and numerous countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He's also director or vice director of a research training group called Global Food. And this CRC, Collaborative Research Center on Indonesia, based at the University of Göttingen. And he's a member of the German National Academy of Sciences, the Leopoldina, and a fellow of the American Agricultural Applied Economics Association. Has written almost 200 reviewed papers, and some of them will be summarized in the lecture today. And Matin, no more words. We are looking forward to your talk and to the discussion afterwards. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. First of all, can you hear me well?
Perfectly so at my end.
Okay, thanks for the kind introduction. And yes, of course, I still do feel like a Rhinelander, at least to some extent. Greetings to Bonn, but I know that there are also people from elsewhere. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're sitting, to all of you. I'm happy to contribute to this series with my talk on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. I certainly try to give a broader overview, but as Jan Börner mentioned, I'll also try to weave in quite a bit of research we did ourselves on this particular topic. I guess most of you may be familiar with the term nutrition-sensitive agriculture, but there's certainly a question, what is it really? What do we mean with it? And I would define it as agriculture that promotes healthy nutrition for all. Now, looking at this definition, one could say, well, isn't agriculture by definition nutrition sensitive because it's producing food and food is needed for nutrition? So isn't that very obvious? And yeah, to some extent it is, but you can certainly not ignore the fact that malnutrition is widespread. Some old problems, some less old and newer problems. We're still talking about 700 million people who are chronically undernourished in terms of calories. We know that there are more than 2 billion people who are micronutrient deficient and 2 billion and growing people who are overweight and obese. And all of these different forms of malnutrition certainly contribute to ill health. The Global Burden of Disease study actually sees nutrition and poor diets as one of the biggest risk factors for poor health and premature death overall. Keeping that in our minds, we can certainly state that agriculture as currently observed is at least not sufficiently nutrition sensitive, and it could be more so. So what I try to do in the next 30 minutes or so of my talk, I have split it up into two parts. The first part is a more global perspective, looking at historical trends of how hunger and malnutrition in agriculture developed with some future challenges. And then the second part is much more a micro level perspective, looking at smallholder farmers in developing countries in particular, because they are not only producing a lot of food, but they also are among those affected mostly by undernutrition. one of the questions is what type of smallholder agriculture can actually be nutrition sensitive or more nutrition sensitive than what we observe today. Now, let me start with the global perspective. 700 million, around 9% of the world population suffer from hunger. These are the latest FAO figures. And those of you who are following those figures every year, we're somehow used to that magnitude. It's hardly getting smaller, it's stagnating. It's possibly getting a little bit worse due to various factors, conflicts and refugees and climate change and COVID-19. So the picture is somewhat bleak, and if we look at this, we at least have a high likelihood of not reaching SDG 2 of zero hunger by 2030. Now, I share this concern and certainly think that much more needs to be done, but I also think that we cannot ignore the fact that significant progress has been made in terms of hunger reduction. And that's certainly important to recognize when we look back 60, 70 years in the mid of the 20th century, around 50% of the world population were hungry. And today we are at those 9%, which is stagnating, okay, but there was obviously quite some development, and this in spite of a tripling of the world population between 1950 and today. So obviously, many more people were fed, and this is to a large extent due to productivity and yield growth in agriculture. What you see here on the left panel is development of cereal yields in tons per hectare for different world regions. And we see that in most of the world regions, spectacular growth, tripling in some areas, quadrupling of cereal yields during this time period since 1990-60. One exception is Africa, the dark line down here, where very slow, hardly any development is observable. And against this background, it's also not surprising when we look at this right-hand chart here that the prevalence of hunger is still much higher in Africa than it is in other world regions. So obviously, there is close relationship between agricultural productivity growth and hunger reduction. And this will continue into the future because the population growth demand also grows due to income growth and the bioeconomy. And we do have scarce natural resources and planetary boundaries. So obviously, more productivity growth will also be important in the future. Now, does that mean that everything is good? We are on a good track and we just need to do more of what we have done in the past? Of course not. I mean, there are at least two issues that deserve to be mentioned here. One is that many of the agricultural production patterns that we observe today have a large environmental and climate footprint. So it needs to become more environmentally friendly and sustainable. The other thing is that so far we have been looking into cereals, and cereals are an important source of calories, but not of micronutrients. And when we look at the global burden of different forms of malnutrition, how it has developed, we see that the global burden of hunger in terms of calorie deficiencies went down much faster than the global burden of micronutrient deficiencies. And we are even in a situation more recently where the health burden of micronutrient deficiencies is larger than the health burden of calorie deficiencies. So obviously, we need to tackle the problem of micronutrient deficiencies in a much more targeted way. One of the responses that CGIAR centers and a few other organizations have is biofortification. Biofortification, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this term, means the breeding of cereals and other staple food crops for higher micronutrient contents. So if poor people eat a lot of rice and wheat and beans and maize, then why not breed more of the relevant micronutrients such as iron, zinc, provitamin A, and others into these crops so that poor people get more of these micronutrients. Harvest Plus is the CGIAR initiative that for more than 20 years has promoted this and worked into this quite successfully. The world map that you see here is a recent map where all those countries where biofortified crop varieties have been released recently are marked in blue. So a lot of research flew into this, and now for the last couple of years, biofortified varieties have been released and are being adopted by farmers in these countries. So this is a successful initiative. Most of this taking place with conventional breeding. Another well-known example that's not part of Harvest Plus is the Golden Rice Project, where, as you know, transgenic GMO approaches have been used. Also a successful product on the technological side, but it's still hanging in the approval because it's GMO. And that's a very politicized process. And takes, unfortunately, much longer, even though success has also been shown there. And there's some hope that in the near future, it may be approved also for commercial use. Regardless of the underlying breeding method, conventional or transgenic, many studies show that biofortified crops can and do help to improve the micronutrient status and the health, and that especially of poor people in rural areas that are often not sufficiently covered by other micronutrient interventions, such as supplementation and industrial fortification programs. And therefore, there is certainly a role to play for biofortified crops. But of course, you know, saying that poor people eat a lot of staple foods, so just try to get all the nutrients into the staple foods is not necessarily the long-term objective. The longer-term objective is certainly that people diversify their diets and get healthy and balanced nutrition from diverse types of foods and crops beyond staple foods. And this brings us to the question, okay, are we actually producing enough of these nutritious foods? And I like this simple graph quite a bit because it's so clearly showing that the answer is no. There's a huge mismatch between what we are producing in world agriculture and what would be needed for healthy and balanced diets. Let me briefly explain what we see here. The left-hand column shows what we produce globally in terms of different types of food. So it's all the foods, you know, broken down into quantity terms, and we see is that well, around 70% here of all the foods produced worldwide are either cereals or oils and fats or sugar. And then the rest is other types of foods. And this is what we should be consuming if we would follow typical food-based dietary guidelines. So what is good for healthy nutrition? And we see that, well, less cereals and especially whole grains, less oils and fats. Sugar doesn't occur at all here for healthy diets, and much more fruits and vegetables, including legumes. And this means that well, we're not producing what would be required if everybody on this planet would try to consume a healthy diet. And that leads to two questions. I mean, first of all, why are we observing this when actually we should be much nearer to this? And secondly, well, how can we come to a situation that looks more like this also in the production? So at least to have the precondition of producing enough healthy and balanced foods that everybody could access that. Well, on the reasons, if we look, what does food security mean and what has it meant for many countries and how have countries tried to achieve food security? It's often primarily in terms of cereals and calories. I mean, there are so many countries that have as their most important food security indicators the self-sufficiency level of rice production or of wheat or maize. It's very heavy focused, and there are regulations like farmers on certain types of lands are not allowed to grow anything else but rice, and so on and so forth. But then there's subsidy policies, not only in poor countries. I mean, in the European Union for decades, we had production subsidies which were tied to cereals, sugar, and oilseeds. So yes, farmers were free to grow what they liked, but when they wanted to get the benefits of these huge subsidies, then they were growing cereals, sugars, and oilseeds. And consumer subsidies in many countries, primarily on cereals and staple foods, research focus in terms of what we have seen, the Green Revolution, primarily on cereals, wheat, rice, and maize. And of course, all of these developments over decades have led to distortions of prices and incentives, not only for farmers, but also for consumers and also for the food industry. What are those cheap and available sources that you can put into your processed and ultra-processed foods? So that's clearly policy distortions that we have here. Distortions that were successful in reducing hunger in a calorie sense. So it's not all bad what we observe, but obviously that's not the future and needs to be rectified. So we need to see a realignment of subsidies and research policies. This is not to say that cereals don't matter. They do matter and will matter into the future, but we need to see that much more is required, stronger focus on also on more nutritious foods. We can certainly say, will we be able to catch up in terms of research with all these neglected crops and crop types or not? And well, of course, one answer is better start today than tomorrow. The good thing is that we do have tools such as new breeding technologies, gene editing, and so on, that can help us speed up productivity progress in crops that were neglected in the past. And this is really something important to make nutrition-sensitive agriculture a reality. I want to lead over to the second part and now take a much more micro-level perspective. As mentioned, smallholder farmers in Africa and Asia, to a lesser extent also Latin America, make up about half of the world's undernourished people. They depend on agriculture not only as a source of food, but also for their livelihoods. And the question we want to address in the coming part is what types of agriculture, what types of policies for smallholder agriculture do we actually need to make the systems more nutrition sensitive? Let me explain one widely used indicator for dietary quality. And this indicator is dietary diversity, usually a dietary diversity score, which measures the number of food groups regularly consumed by people during either 24 hours or a 7-day period or so. This is closely related to dietary quality and micronutrient status. Quite plausibly, right? Because when you're very poor and you're only eating cereals and staple foods, your dietary diversity is low. When you're eating many more different types of foods and food groups, the likelihood that you're getting sufficient of the various nutrients that you need is much higher. So it's a very simple but powerful indicator for dietary quality. So one of the questions we need to ask is, how can we achieve smallholder farm households to become more diverse in their diets, in their dietary quality? And of course, it's a very intuitive answer to say, well, since many of them are subsistence oriented, they should just produce more diversely, so have more of different crop types and livestock types on their farm, and then they'll also consume more diversely. And this intuitive answer is one that was picked up in recent years by large project initiatives that have large institutes, whole institutes and programs that were started to foster farm diversification by introducing additional types of crops or livestock species. We want to analyze that in some more detail. I mean, when we look at the relationship between farm production diversity and household dietary diversity in a complete subsistence setting, would say, well, there's a close, one-to-one relationship. If everything that you produce is what you eat, then that should be true. But we know that obviously markets exist, even when they're often not working perfectly well, but they exist, and there's some market sales that occur. That's creating cash income, and that's making it possible for these households also to purchase food in the market. And here, the relationship between increasing farm diversity is not necessarily that it'll improve your cash income. The contrary may be true, because when you're increasing your diversity, then you may not build on your comparative advantage. You may forego gains from specialization, and therefore it may be possible that there's a positive partial effect through here, but a negative partial effect through this. And this is something we want to look into a little bit more deeply. There's empirical evidence on this. And actually the empirical evidence on this question is relatively recent. Quite a number of studies, around 50, that we identified that have looked at the associations between farm production diversity and diets in smallholder households. Most of them actually done during the last 5 to 10 years. So a relatively recent body of literature. What most of these studies do is to estimate simple regression models like this, where you have dietary diversity score here as the left-hand side variable, and you try to explain that by the production diversity on the farm. So that's the same farm household here. And then, then of course, you're controlling for lots of other things that may be farm size and education and gender and market distance and so on and so forth. So we are particularly interested in beta 1. If it's true that production diversity or an increase in production diversity has a positive effect on dietary diversity, then beta 1 would be positive and significant. And we did a systematic review together with Kibrom Sibatu from my group and analyzed all these different studies and found out that of the studies existing in terms of the main conclusions by the original study authors, around 70% show a clearly positive association. But then there are also 9% that show mixed results. And I should explain what mixed results may mean. A single study may look at different regions. They may use different indicators of production or dietary diversity, or they may even look at different countries. And this means single studies often have more than one estimate. And this means that, for instance, they use one indicator and they get a positive result, and they use another indicator in the same study and get a null result. So that means mixed. And then there are also 22, almost 1/4 of the studies that do not find any positive association at all. But this is based on the main conclusions of the original study authors. So whatever they wrote either into the abstract or into the conclusion section of their study. But we looked at the studies more carefully and found out after careful reading that actually only 11% of the studies show a clearly positive association. Around 2/3 show mixed results and 24% show no positive association at all. So obviously, when you're doing a study and you're getting mixed results, then the authors highlight whatever they think should be highlighted. But when you take a deeper look, you're finding a somewhat different picture sometimes. Another interesting observation is that hardly any of the existing studies looked at effect sizes. So how big is this effect? I mean, it can be big or small. It can be significant or insignificant, but those are two different questions. And In all those studies that we identified, in total, there were 213 regression models. Yeah, 50 studies, but each had several regression models with different indicators, as I explained. And out of those 213 regression models, 51% showed a significantly positive association, half. In terms of the magnitude, if we take all the 213 regressions together, we get to this result, 0.062. What does that mean? This means that if you increase your farm production diversity by one species, you add one crop species or one livestock species, then the effect on the number of food groups consumed will be 0.062. This is small. It's statistically significant, but it means that you would have to produce 18 additional species on your farm in order to get to one additional food group consumed. So hardly a very powerful and effective strategy. Yes, there are some regional differences, a little bit larger, but still small when you look at Africa alone. In other regions, tiny and not even statistically significant. So the small magnitude may surprise, and it did surprise us to some extent. How is this possible when many of these farms are subsistence oriented? Well, the question is, what do we mean with subsistence oriented? It means that they keep a lot of what they produce for home consumption, but it doesn't mean that most of what they consume comes from home production. And especially not for food groups that are subject to seasonality, water availability, and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, this is data from Ethiopia here, nationally representative, showing that close to 70% of all the cereals are coming from subsistence production that are consumed in small farm households. But that share is much, much lower on average for many of the more nutritious foods. So in terms of dietary diversity, markets matter a lot. And does that mean that most households do not produce those types of crops? Well, especially in Africa, farm households are extremely diverse. This is looking at just 3 countries here where we carried out research ourselves. And this means 10 or 10.2 means that in Ethiopia, the average farm with a farm size of 1.6 hectares produces more than 10 different species on the farm. Extremely diverse. And they don't do that because of only looking at diets. They do that particularly as a risk coping mechanisms and limited market access. And that's not an exception. You see that in Kenya and Uganda, that looks similar, even at smaller farm sizes. So if in these situations you try to convince farmers to grow more of different foods, obviously you're pushing them further into subsistence and that may lead foregoing market potentials. And we have used data from Kenya to look at the partial effects. The green bar here shows the total effect of production diversity on dietary diversity, but that's made up of 2 partial effects. That's the subsistence effect, which is bigger and positive, but it's the market effect that's negative and leads to an overall small effect. And that's something we need to keep in mind. It doesn't mean at all that in certain situations it cannot be useful to further diversify, but looking into how diversified these farms actually are, we also need to recognize that further diversification may not be the best thing for them. So what have you learned so far? This is not the concluding slide. This is just an intermediate type of lessons learned. We need more diverse food systems. That's what I highlighted from the macro perspective. And now it may even seem like a contradiction to say, but we don't need more diversity at the farm level. Well, it's not a contradiction at all, because the optimal level of diversity is a question of scale. I mean, when you have some division of labor, it doesn't mean that every single household needs to produce everything that makes up diverse food systems. Then the question is, okay, what are possibly better and more effective strategies for smallholders to improve their diets and nutrition? There are 2 aspects that I want to highlight a little bit more: market access, market functioning, and technological innovation, with a few examples also from our research. Let me start with the commercialization and nutrition aspect. Commercialization, many people think of large commercial farms. This is not at all what I mean here. Commercialization just means that you may have a very small farm that's producing in a more market-oriented way. So it's commercializing in terms of selling more of its output. That's what's meant here. And we are interested in what that may mean for nutrition. Show you one example from Kenya that we did recently. That's a fairly large data set where we're showing, if you're just looking at descriptive statistics of more and less market-oriented or commercialized households, we are seeing that the more commercialized households are less affected by undernutrition in terms of calories and micronutrients, so they're better off. We should not hastily conclude that commercialization is good, because these are simple descriptive statistics, and it may mean that those are richer, those are larger farms, it may mean anything. So it's not a controlled experiment. What we did is we try to control for all of these possibly confounding factors and look at the intake of calories or micronutrients as a function of the level of commercialization, and controlling for all those things that I mentioned may be confounding here. And estimating these models shows us that actually commercialization has a positive and relatively big effect on calorie and micronutrient consumption, which is statistically significant in most cases, except for vitamin A. There it's positive, but not statistically significant. So they're doing better. After controlling for other things, commercialization is good for diets and nutrition. We went further and looked into the mechanisms. What do they get from market purchases? This is positive and statistically significant. Don't get confused with a different magnitude here. This is vitamin A, which is measured in retinol equivalents, micrograms per gram. This is milligrams. So this is, this is about 20% of the recommended dietary allowance of people. So it's not a small effect, but obviously, depending on what you look at, the absolute effect differs. That's perhaps less surprising. When they're more commercialized, they have higher cash incomes, they buy more from the market. More surprising is that we don't see negative effects here for the subsistence pathway. You just assume that a household either sells something or keeps something for subsistence. They would say, whatever you sell, you cannot consume anymore. So therefore, we would expect negative effects here. We don't see that. So obviously, commercialization is not that zero-sum game, but they're using better technologies. They have access to better inputs. They're producing more on with the given resources, and that's good. You may see there's one exception, and that's vitamin A. And vitamin A, what's the main source of vitamin A for these households? Well, we know that animal source products are a good source of vitamin A, but these households are very poor. They consume little animal source products. The main source of vitamin A in these households is green leafy vegetables, beta-carotene in green leafy vegetables. And what's happening is that local markets for green leafy vegetables, which are quite perishable, they're not well developed. They don't function well, and this means that more commercialized households do not grow a lot of green leafy vegetables, and they also don't grow them anymore for home consumption. So what could be done? Well, we could say, well, just tell them that they should all grow green leafy vegetables to get enough of their vitamin A, possibly, but the better strategy, depending on who you talk to, may be to make markets for green leafy vegetables work better, and therefore provide market incentives for farmers, at least some farmers, to grow these and also make them more available than in markets. And this leads us to another example also from Kenya, where actually there are certain private sector initiatives to for farmers to grow green leafy vegetables. And this is supermarket contracts. I mean, probably you know that supermarkets in Kenya and many other countries of Africa are spreading quite substantially. And especially in the larger cities, they are having these types of fresh fruit and vegetable sections. And they're attractive among consumers, especially the middle and upper urban income consumers. Because when you buy those in traditional markets, you're also always getting lower quality and often not so fresh types of leafy vegetables. Here you have air conditioning, you have sprinkling, and it's really done well. But of course, when you contract farmers to grow these vegetables, then you have an incentive for farmers to grow more of them. And we have shown with data that the supermarket contracts do lead to significantly higher incomes for farmers, but also to improve nutrition because some of the green leafy vegetables are also consumed at home. And here are, with a very similar approach as the one before, showing the net effects of supermarket contracts in terms of calories and micronutrients. And here we suddenly see a huge effect on vitamin A intakes as well. So that's a market-led incentive to grow more of these and seems to be working quite well here through new emerging supermarket supply chains. One thing that we haven't touched upon is gender. And I think it's an important question when we look at farm commercialization. Yes, there's household income that can grow, their effects on farm production patterns, or what farmers grow or don't grow. And of course, through different channels, those can impact household nutrition, but gender can as well. And we do know from a lot of research that when farming becomes more commercially oriented and more cash income is involved, that often men take over traditional roles that were previously held by women. And this also means that women are losing some of their bargaining power, they're losing some of the control over income. And one may argue then, well, perhaps it doesn't matter who in the household controls the income. Unfortunately, it does matter. And we know not only from Africa, but from various contexts that $1 of income in the hands of women has more positive effects on nutrition and health of family members than the same dollar held by male household members. And of course, that's a thing that we need to consider and take into account. Coming back to the example of supermarket contracts in Kenya, the same study that I showed you summary results of, we are finding with our data that yes, income is up, vegetable production is up, but female control of production and income is down through the supermarket contracts. And this is also leading to a partial negative effect on nutrient intakes here. So should we conclude then that all farms should not commercialize and stay subsistent in order to prevent that from happening? Of course not, because in total we do have a large positive effect, but understanding what the partial effects are can help us to design commercialization projects and programs that are more gender sensitive and can therefore perhaps prevent this from happening. Initiatives could look like providing contracts particularly for women, or providing special training and access to credits, and so on and so forth. So it's important to know that and not necessarily to take that as an argument for maintaining subsistence. A bit on technology. Come back to the gender question because that also plays a role for technology. I would like to start with a technology that's probably not the first thing that comes to your mind when thinking about food and agriculture, and that's mobile phone technologies. Most of you will know that there has been a mobile phone revolution in Africa and other developing country regions. In Africa, we're seeing mobile phone adoption rates of more than 80% by now. This is not smartphones with internet. No, these are simple mobile phones and especially in rural areas. In remote rural areas, adoption rates are even higher than in urban areas. It's a typical leapfrog type of technology because all of these people in rural areas had never access to a landline phone. Now they have access to mobile phones, and that certainly provides better access to information and markets. It helps to reduce transactions costs significantly. And is also a platform for other innovations, including mobile money transfers and the like. We have done extensive research on mobile phones in countries of Eastern Africa, including Kenya and Uganda. As I've talked about Kenya already, let me share some results on Uganda here for mobile phones. We are finding with quantitative econometric approaches, income is up by mobile phone use in a magnitude of more than 30%. It's a huge effect, but imagine what you can all do and with a mobile phone in terms of being able to have better access to information technologies, markets, better prices, and so on and so forth. Nutrition is up. Nutrition measured here in terms of dietary diversity scores, so a dietary quality indicator, but also women's roles has improved. And this is something that we measured in terms of who in the household controls the income and who in the household holds what and owns what type of productive resources. We see that mobile phone use in the households improves women's positions within the household. I think that's not at all surprising because you look at women being much more marginalized and constrained in their access to information, to prices and markets. That also means that the potential benefits for them of using mobile phones are bigger, and that's what we are seeing here. And of course, the more information, the more income you have, the stronger is your position within the household. And we also collected gender disaggregated data on mobile phone use. So this year is based on anyone in the household uses a mobile phone, but here we see when we split it up by male and female users of mobile phones, that the effects when females in the household use the mobile phone on both income and nutrition are actually larger than when male household members alone use the mobile phone. So an interesting and possibly somewhat unexpected result. Not unexpected when we think about it, but perhaps not on first sight. But of course, technology, there are many other technologies that can matter to make smallholder farming more nutrition sensitive. I talked about biofortification at the macro part, but overall, analyzing adoption and impacts of agricultural technologies is one of the oldest topics that agricultural economists have worked on. But typically they have worked on looking into what it means for yields, what it means for incomes and so forth. There are actually quite few studies that really look at the effects of technologies on agricultural technologies on diets and nutrition. In the last couple of years, there have been a few studies, and it's a growing field, but not yet very populated. The evidence that's available shows that if well adapted to smallholder conditions, and of course that's a big if, but then different types of different types of technologies, including breeding, but also agronomic and digital technologies can be quite crucial to increase resilience and improve food security and nutrition. I'd like to close the empirical part with one example that's definitely one where most people don't primarily think of improved nutrition, and that's GMO insect-resistant cotton in India. It's a cash crop, it's a GMO. People would usually not think in terms of this technology to improve nutrition. It's also not the main idea of this technology. It reduces pesticide yield and increases yields and income. But that income effect, which is happening in India, really in a small farm context, leads to improved calorie and micronutrient consumption. And we show with panel data that we have collected over many years that actually these households are really significantly doing better in terms of livelihoods and food security. This brings me to the conclusion. Agriculture needs to become more diverse. That's for sure the case, and that's good for nutrition and for the environment. But diversity is not necessarily, more diversity is not necessarily something to strive at every scale, and especially not when we look at those very diverse smallholder farms that I've shown you. So it's important to keep that in mind. What matters most for smallholder farmers is improving markets and market access and market functioning. Not only for cereals, of course, we need better markets for diverse types of foods, including perishable foods, fruits and foods, while strengthening women's roles. And those are key strategies that will also facilitate technological innovation. Better market access certainly improves technological innovation. These are some of the policy conclusions. I also have two research implications. First of all, there's really scope for more research to combine agriculture, economic, and nutrition research, analyze the nutrition and health effects of agricultural interventions, which is not yet a very dense field. Much more can and should be done. And of course, integration of agricultural research with human health and planetary health research in broader interdisciplinary ways. This is something that is certainly required if you're serious about sustainable food systems. With this, I want to close and thank you for your attention.
Well, Martin, thank you very much for a fabulous lecture, packed full with interesting evidence-based research insights. I am happy to kick off the discussion and encourage people to raise their blue hand in the hand function if they are eager to talk, or better, write questions in the chat. Write questions in the chat. Then we can track this consecutively and maybe package some of your questions or comments. Don't hesitate to also comment. While you are reflecting on Professor Qaim's lecture, let me just recap. He started out with a clear definition of what nutrition-sensitive agriculture means. And it's an agriculture that promotes healthy nutrition for all. He touched upon, with detailed evidence-based research, key sets of interventions and processes. I just highlight them: diversification, commercialization, biofortification, digitization, women empowerment, agricultural technology, and all in a market context. So these were key highlights, and many of these are controversial topics. I'm sure colleagues know that. Again, Matin, thank you very much. Let's see what's coming here in the chat. And let me see if there is anyone who prefers to chat with words. I don't see that yet. Here is the first one. Does contracting farmers, I read the question to you, does contracting farmers to grow more GLVs for supermarkets also significantly improve household nutrition of smallholder farmers, as most of the produced food is moved to the cities rather than being sold locally in rural areas? Vegetables and so on. Are there, it continues, any initiatives to keep more of the produced freshly vegetables, green leafy vegetables in these areas, or are these supermarket initiatives so far restricted to larger cities? So you have done work on connections between farmers, value chains, supermarkets, fresh products. Can you comment on that? Does it work to improve household nutrition?
Yes, it's a good question, because obviously what's happening is that the supermarket boom is much more in the bigger cities. It's spreading to smaller cities and towns, but it's usually starting with processed foods and not with these fresh vegetable and fruit sections that I showed you. That may come in 5 or 10 years, but that's usually what we see is when supermarkets are spreading out to smaller cities, then they do so first of all with processed foods. And that means the supermarket contracts for green leafy vegetables are primarily leading to improvements in vegetable consumption in those households that are producing these, because some of the stuff that they're not selling, they're consuming. It may, perhaps some of the stuff that's not meeting the supermarket quality standards end up also in local markets, but a lot is being transported really to the cities. And I would fully agree if the comment is the supermarket development enough to make markets work and function? I would say no, it's not. Of course, we need better functioning markets also in the more traditional rural and small town markets, and that requires improved market infrastructure, improved storage, and so on and so forth. So the example that I showed is, I think, one that can contribute, but should not be seen as the panacea for solving market access problems for perishable foods.
Mm-hmm. Matin, a question from Pallavi in India. How does COVID impact your analysis? Given the context of the pandemic, should public policy be focusing on agriculture commercialization as a pathway to increase rural nutrition, or should production diversification for self-consumption be the focus? So does the pandemic suggest more subsistence orientation, to put it more simply?
My answer is clearly no, because obviously farm production systems and food systems have to deal with new types of risks. And one of these risks is pandemic. Of course, if you really have complete lockdowns, then subsistence may be the thing that rescues you. But I think better functioning markets and modern markets is actually something that can help much more. Markets are so important for other types of risks. If you look at climate risks, I mean, what do you do if you're a subsistence farmer and there's a heavy drought? I mean, we need to think broader about risks, and I think well-functioning markets are incredibly important, but markets are not well-functioning. And you're right that during the COVID-19 lockdowns in many countries, it was particularly the perishable fruits and fresh food markets that were closed, and that meant hardship in terms of selling and buying these things. But there we need improvement. I mean, the lockdown type of measures were not handled well in many countries. And I think learning from that experience means strengthening markets, not subsistence.
We jump between topics, but this is no problem for you. You will love this question here. Natalie Leibach asks, how can we address the rather conservative, in quotation mark, research landscape, speaking of Germany, for instance, to enhance research on neglected crops, rather than saying, why do you investigate amaranth, go for barley instead? What's your research policy assessment there?
Well, I mean, we need a big change in terms of mentality. Of course, when you look at private sector research, there's two elements. I mean, first of all, when it comes to breeding, is where can you make money, and what are the things that farmers want to grow. And obviously, if we have such a heavy, distorted policy environment as I described it, it's not done with just telling people, you know, an individual breeder or researcher do more on amaranth. We need certainly a bigger change in the mentality of research funders and policymakers and researchers and the broader science community. So, I mean, defining what the priorities are for countries and programs, I think is important, and it cannot and should not all flow into wheat and rice and maize. However, I do understand all those colleagues sitting at IRI and CIMMYT and saying, but don't overdo. We certainly also in the future will need cereals, and I agree. We need more research, but more research on a broader portfolio of things. I'm sure this is not satisfactorily answering the question of how to really get it done, but I think it's really a broader initiative that we need, involving all players and not only individual researchers.
There's a question from Peter Derman, who is wondering whether red palm oil, which is produced by smallholders in West Africa, could be used to improve the supply of provitamin A on local and distant markets. How about palm oil?
It could to some extent, but what we are observing is that in West Africa, there's more and more investment by larger mechanized mills that are not producing the red palm oil that's quite common in the local markets, but it's also quite perishable. The larger mechanized mills, they're producing in the end refined palm oil, which is not containing beta-carotene anymore, which has a longer shelf life, and that's directly tied. I mean, the beta-carotene shortens the shelf life of the oil, and therefore I do see potential certainly for that playing a small role. But when we see growth in the palm oil sector, it will likely be growth in areas that do not provide the service of beta-carotene no longer.
Mm-hmm. Here's an interesting question, which I read to you, and then I add my own question or comment to it. The question is from Carolina Santos Nino. Is there any evidence about the nutritional education inclusion into those projects and its impact on dietary diversity? Let me add my comment. Isn't it much more a need to invest in a nutrition-sensitive consumer rather than nutrition-sensitive agriculture in order to drive dietary change? The oldest randomized control trial I know in the field of food in the second half of the 1980s in the Philippines, which we did in those days at IFPRI, found that there was a strong over and above effect of nutrition education in commercialization programs. What's your response to Carolina and to the general issue investing in the nutrition sensitive consumer?
I mean, I agree that because the topic was on nutrition-sensitive agriculture, I didn't focus enough on the important role of nutrition education and awareness among consumers, and that's important. I would not at all see that as either or, and nutrition education can be successful both in rural and urban areas, but there are two small caveats that I'd like to mention. First of all, many people assume that nutrition education is cheap and easy, and it's not. It's very expensive, and it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It should be done, and we should look for more cost-effective ways of doing that. And we have done ourselves research, for instance, on combining agricultural extension and nutrition training. So one thing, piggybacking on something that's already existing with actually quite interesting results that showed that it can work if done properly. And I would always fully say, yes, that's important, because in the end, it's the market link. And when the consumers provide the incentives that they want to buy more nutritious stuff, then markets and farmers will react. But policies and changes in agriculture can, of course, help because that can make access to nutritious foods more affordable and can support nutrition education programs that teach people to eat more fruits and vegetables. So prices do play a role. And I don't think that we can and should look for isolated fixes. Here's we do this and then everything will be fine. I think we need approaches on the agricultural side and on the consumer side. So clear, yes, nutrition education plays a role, but it's not a short-term, cheap type of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Isaac Bunuedi from Ghana, who refers to his work in Sierra Leone, also comments on nutrition knowledge. Some people in your audience were interested in knowledge, nutrition education, and linking that with the interventions. Not separate, but linking it with it. So 2 or 3 more such points. Let me turn to Gabriel Schaaf. I quote, you mentioned golden rice developed by Potrikos Bayer and others to combat vitamin A deficiencies. It is now approved in Bangladesh, if I'm not mistaken. Could you comment on the hurdles of that crop? Go ahead.
Well, it hasn't been fully commercialized neither in Bangladesh nor in the Philippines. Those are the 2 countries where it's nearest to being used practically. It basically has received green light from the authorities, but there's still some final approval for commercial production or practical production farmers' fields that's missing. And it's still being held up by very intensive debates by biotech critics and proponents. I mean, obviously, there's cause for optimism that it will be released, and then it can show whether it's highly effective or not. I mean, all the different tests that were done, including feeding tests on various groups suggests that the beta carotene is bioavailable and the rice is fairly acceptable in terms of color and taste. But I think then once it's really released, it will start to see how widely it's adopted and used. So I'm very frustrated about the long time that it was held back in terms of debates and unsubstantiated claims of all the dangers that are not really there. But it doesn't mean that we already know that's a very effective technology. We don't, and that's something that remains to be seen. But why not try it out?
You are not surprised, Matin, that there are more questions on GMOs. Anna Maria Pires wants to know about the implications of the pesticide-resistant cotton on soil quality and biodiversity. Let me mention a couple of others who have touched on GMOs, and then we call this settled. Niklas Gerber comments, besides reduced negative effects of pesticide use thanks to GM cotton, or the perception that production diversification may have positive environmental effects, how do you suggest to link your research to concerns of environmental sustainability and planetary boundaries? So the environmental externalities are touched upon.
Okay, makes it difficult to think where to start, because the first part was about GMOs and the latter part was much broader than this. I think the evidence and research on GMOs and BT crops in particular, so those containing Bacillus thuringiensis soil bacteria genes, that's such that any effects on either soil organisms or other non-target organisms, including honeybees and others, are much, much less harmful in comparison to chemical pesticides, insecticides, and therefore it is a clear environmental advantage if the resistance can be kept effective through proper resistance management. The other question on how can overall the research be linked to environment and planetary boundaries? Well, I mean, one of the important aspects on the, or topics on the future research agenda is that we should not stop at looking at income or nutrition effects, but in the same studies also analyze environmental dimensions in terms of biodiversity, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, because otherwise we continue with having isolated type of research bodies looking at partial effects, but we will never be able to fully understand the trade-offs or also synergies that there may be between different types of SDG dimensions. And that's really what we need. So I think we need research in broader interdisciplinary groups that are able to design research frameworks that fit well together. We're trying to do that in some of the research in Indonesia and elsewhere to do exactly that. And it is sometimes challenging because every discipline has its own indicators, its own language, its own concerns. But I think there's no way of continuing to do research in those silos. We need to bring it together. And I think that's the research agenda. And I think that good initiatives are happening into that direction. Oftentimes things are too slow. We would love for them to be faster. But I think a lot has happened in the last few years, and I'm optimistic that the research landscape and what we consider to be the right questions, that's moving into very interesting directions. Technology certainly will have a role to play. As well as consumption changes, including ourselves sitting here in the rich countries and eating too much meat and wasting too much. I mean, I've not tackled on these things because that's a different topic, but I'm a fan of technology, but I do also know and understand that it's not the only thing that matters. But it's not either or, it's
okay.
both.
Okay. There's a question which relates to what you have just touched upon, climate change. Abdul Rashid Isa asks or comments, I'm keen to know your thoughts about how climate change will affect dietary diversity, especially of smallholders. For instance, I was wondering if you think farmers may be reluctant to plant crops that fail under extreme weather conditions, like increasing temperatures. So is there something related to risk and resilience and diversity under climate change, which may work against some of the trends of commercialization?
Well, I do share the concerns. I mean, if you look at the climate models and their impacts on crop yields, we believe that we understand quite a bit about maize and wheat and rice. There are not that many studies that have looked at possible effects on horticulture crops. So yes, and of course, many horticulture crops need good and stable access to water, and that may become a huge challenge with climate change in many parts of the world. So definitely there's a challenge which means even more that we need better technologies to make systems and crops more resilient to climate change. There's also interesting research that's showing that the increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the air may lower the micronutrient contents of cereal crops. And all of those are important insights. And we certainly need much better models, not only for the major cereals, but for other types of crops. I think diversity, increasing diversity is of course good, because a more diverse system generally is a more resilient system, but that may also be a simplistic statement when we look deeper into what are the crops that will suffer more from weather shocks than others. And yes, cereals may be more resilient per se than more nutritious crops.
Yeah. Lisa Bieber-Freudenberger comments, I quote, industrialization of agriculture and different market effects have led to problematic trends, including biodiversity loss and land degradation. A larger degree of commercialization might be desirable if you have a relatively small and diversified farm. But how do you stop the trend of increasing industrialization once commercialization has started this trend? So from commercialization to industrialization to degradation.
Yeah, I mean, industrialization is a term that's hard to define, but typically it's associated with larger plot and farm sizes and mechanization and lots of external inputs. I mean, we did have in the past a trend towards, in Europe at least, and other rich countries, a trend towards larger plots, larger field sizes, larger farms, which was primarily driven by mechanization and large machinery and the high cost of labor. I see that I mean, first of all, we know that the problem with biodiversity in agricultural landscapes is much less related to the farm size than to the field size. So having smaller field sizes with lots of trees and natural elements in the landscape can preserve a lot of the biodiversity. The other part of the answer is that both new breeding technologies, but also new digital technologies in terms of precision farming and robotics are actually able to work on small farms and small plots, and much more so than the large machinery that we saw in the past. So therefore, I certainly share the concern that we don't want to see more of the widespread large field monocultures without any other landscape elements. That's not useful. That's hurting biodiversity. But I think we can and should make sure that technologies are developing into directions that can help sustainability. It will not happen automatically, because when we really think of data and digital technologies and ownership of data by only large companies, it may not necessarily happen into directions that we would like to see. And therefore, there are big open questions which involve a lot of research to make sure that we do guide technologies into the directions that they can support sustainability. Transformative technologies can do good and bad things. And we need to make sure, as the stewards of these technologies, that they're developed and used into the right directions.
Okay. I know we have already touched on technologies and controversies about it, but let's, as there are several who find this important, let me read one more to you. Bezovic, a senior researcher at CEF, sees in her research that promoting pesticides for reducing crop losses has a positive effect on reducing hunger and stunting, but this is a sensitive intervention. What's your view on that?
My long-term view is, my short-term view is that we certainly need to see and understand the context, and crying for bans of chemical pesticides may be the right thing in one setting and may not be the right thing in another setting, depending on the trade-offs such as described by the researcher. In the longer run, I do see trends that we can reduce chemical pesticides through better types of technologies. And that includes the ones I've already mentioned, breeding and digital technologies and improved agronomy. The stunting relationship is particularly one that's related to mycotoxins. And yes, I mean, aflatoxin is extremely toxic, and you have that in many smallholder systems in Africa, in maize and in groundnuts. Of course, I mean, fungicides, or also, I mean, not only chemical, also biological fungicides and pest control agents may help. But there are also other ways that we should look into, because I don't see that sustainable agriculture in the future will be agriculture that will require always more chemical inputs. I don't see that. I see the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Returning to market-related questions, there's one from Jan Berner. To the extent that food prices affect consumption choices, would you expect policies that internalize the environmental externalities of agriculture to have a relevant impact on improving diets and nutrition? So market effect, and then there was a more specific one related to the trade relationships between Europe and Africa, and the meat trade in particular, which I had seen by a colleague mentioned. So would you comment a bit on the broader market effects of the strategies which you mentioned, and the specific one which Jan mentions, internalizing environmental externalities?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as economists, we always argue that external costs should be internalized. It's easier said than done. But we need to move into that direction. I mean, we certainly do know that certain foods are particularly intensive in terms of their climate and environmental footprint. And we have just 2-3 weeks ago published a large report by the Scientific Advisory Board for the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture on more sustainable nutrition, where we do speak in favor of price incentives. That could be taxes on sugar, that could be taxes on meat and animal products, or at least reductions of the value-added tax reductions that we see. The latter one is particularly here for rich countries. I think, I mean, in a globalized world, it's not so easy for countries to implement taxes, but the good thing is implementing taxes at the consumer level is much easier, even without violating WTO rules, than taxing or subsidizing at the producer level. So I do think that there is an important role to play for price incentives, internalizing both positive and negative externalities, and countries and governments should be a little bit more courageous into moving into those directions. Whether that will lead to huge consumption changes, that's a different question. I don't expect huge changes, but that also depends on the magnitude of the tax, right? So, but as mentioned before, I don't see that we have here this one type of quick fix and that'll solve it all. We should think broad, and I think Howdy Buis from IFPRI, he has recently said, I mean, the sustainable food system idea is great, but it's also kind of stifling people to act because it's so broad and everything belongs to everything that where exactly to start is difficult. And we need to break it down. I mean, there are so many individual steps that can and should be taken. And I think price policies are certainly one of the things that do play a role.